Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting the ninth topic of the semester. It's titled Vikings, Mongols, and Aztecs. We're going to be looking at a period of time from 900 all the way to 1500 AD. This is a time when there was around the world the increasing movement of nomadic groups, particularly those that live in the northern globe, for example. And they're going to be moving into the more warmer regions of the planet, and they're going to be invading civilizations. And because of those invasions, there will be significant transformations taking place within those civilizations that really had existed for not only hundreds of years, but for thousands of years. And we're going to see a deep change taking place as a result, not only because of the invasions, as I will explain, but also because of the merging of nomadic and sedentary societies or sedentary cultures. All right, so let us move to our outline. So we can look at the title, then the table of contents, and then we're going to be moving into the introduction and also part one, the Vikings. So once again, this is topic number 9, Vikings, Mongols, Aztecs, nomadic invasions, and climate change in the remaking of world civilizations from 900 to 1500 or 1521. 1521 is really the fall of the Aztec Empire. All right, so as the table of contents show, we will first look at the introduction, and the introduction is going to look at the impact of nomadic groups over the civilized world. We're going to take a quick glance at, for example, the ways that in the past, in the ancient world, for example, the nomads had exerted a significant influence in the civilization that we have looked at, for example. So it's only to summarize, if you will. But also the introduction is going to bring the discussion of the influence of the nomads of the civilized world to this period of time, the 900s all the way to, let's say, the 1500s. And we will explain why now the nomads are going to play a key role in reshaping civilizations. Okay, we're going to provide an analysis that has to do with the environment. Once we do that, then we're going to move into the main parts of the topic. Part 1 is going to start with the Vikings, the nomadic, semi-nomadic groups of Northern Europe that will raid the European continent. And they're going to really have a very significant impact and influence in reshaping Europe. In fact, Europe from this point onwards is going to acquire many of the characteristics, again, of the nomads that it invaded, particularly the Vikings, and we're going to get to explore that. Part 2 is going to look at Asia, another group of nomads from northern Asia. The Mongols are going to create a very large empire and overrun China. And not only that, but they're going to create a very large land-based empire that is going to stretch all over to the Middle East, for example, Eastern Europe, Russia as well. And they're going to also impact significantly the civilizations that it invaded, not only China, but also the Muslim world as well. We're going to get to see that as well, significant changes. Last but not least, we're going to be moving now to the Western Hemisphere and to look at another group of nomads that is also going to be moving from the northern parts of what today is the United States into the Central Valley of Mexico and take over the civilization of the region, particularly the Toltecs, and they're going to create a very large empire that will stretch for most of central Mexico and parts of Central America as well. And we're going to get to see also the fall of the Aztec Empire with the coming of the Spanish in 1519. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, is also going to be assessed, quite briefly, but also within the context of the Spanish representing also the byproduct of nomadic groups that invaded Spain, for example, the Visigoths, that got invaded by the Muslims, which were considered, the Arabs that invaded the Arabian Peninsula, another group of nomadic groups that were on the move, created, of course, the caliphates that we looked at in the previous topic. And then we see the formation of a very highly militarized, culture in the Iberian Peninsula. It's a combination, really, of nomadic cultures, the Visigothic, for example, and also the Arab. And then with the discovery of America, as the Spaniards are moving into the Americas, we see the clash of nomadic war machines, in this case, the Spanish and the Aztecs as well. So again, all of that will be explained in this context, how significant the nomads have been in shaping world history and shaping world civilizations. All right, so let us look now at our introduction, general introduction. And as I said, we do have to look at the impact of the nomads over the civilized world, just to gain a very general understanding of how important the nomads have been in shaping world history. One of the things I've stressed ever since the beginning of the course is that, civilizations were projects that really were the creations of a tiny minority, a tiny fraction of the world's population. They were the ones that were moving into the rivers, experimenting with, irrigation systems, etc., domesticating plants, maximizing production, building urban centers, etc. But the vast majority of the human population were still living outside of civilization. Some of them were horticulturalists, others were hunters and gatherers, others were pastoralists, moving from place to place, etc. But the vast majority, again, of the world population were considered to be non-civilized or nomads, labeled as barbarians in many cases by the civilized groups. But nonetheless, the nomads, those that lived outside civilization, continued to exert significant influence on the sedentary societies on so many levels. We looked at, for example, in the second topic of the semester, how the movement of the Indo-Europeans, for example, out of the Eurasian region of modern day, for example, Ukraine, the Caucasus Mountains, for example, many of whom moved into parts of the Near East, others into the Far East. They changed the character of the civilizations that had existed there for thousands of years, like Egypt, for example. And in many cases, because the Indo-Europeans, which were nomadic and were very warlike, are going to change the character of those civilizations. For example, Egypt transformed itself from a peaceful, kind of a spiritual, mystical-oriented civilization into a warrior empire. And that was a result, again, of the invasions it received from Asia Minor, the groups that entered the region, for example. There were the Hittites and the Hyksos, for example, that invaded Egypt. And that changed the nature, again, of Egypt. We see the rise of, in Mesopotamia as well, of empires as a result, once again, of the Indo-Europeans that have been pressuring groups in the region, particularly the Hittites, that were waging war against the Assyrians. The Assyrians, which were a group of nomads that live in Mesopotamia, after waging war for about thousands of years, about 1,000 years against the Hittites, were able to also acquire the skills of war and build their own Assyrian empire, and also the Persian Empire. The Persians are considered themselves to be Indo-European as well. And they also built a very large empire in Mesopotamia. So obviously, one of the impacts that the nomads have had over the civilized world is the creation of new kinds of states that were dedicated to war. Okay? This is one of the most obvious, of course, impacts that we have looked at in this course in the past. Other kinds of impacts deal with cultural change. The nomads, they do have their own cultures, of course. They are moving from place to place. They domesticated the horse very, very early on, before even the civilizations of the ancient world. And their nomadic culture, as it interacted, in many cases invaded the civilizations. They also changed, to a certain degree, the cultural characteristics of those ancient civilizations. For example, the Turkic nomads of China's Asia exerted significant influence in the development of Chinese civilization, like the Zhou, for example. The Zhou dynasty were originally Turkic. And they really, again, invaded China. They displaced the Shang dynasty, if you remember. And they created one of the most stable, long-standing dynasties in Chinese history. And there were nomads. Of course, over time, the Zhou ended up adopting the Chinese culture. They acculturated to the Chinese way of life, of course. But they also brought with them their own culture into China as well. The domestication of horse, creation of cavalries, for example, and so on. The Tang dynasty, much, much later, if you remember during the discussion of China, the Tang dynasty that extended and reached out into the western frontier incorporated many nomadic groups into Chinese society, and Chinese society was heavily influenced by nomadic culture during that period of time in China's history, from the 600s to the 900s AD. And it was at some point during the Tang Dynasty, China kind of disconnecting itself from its classical roots, just because of the influence of nomadic peoples and nomadic lifestyles. Okay. In the previous topic, We also saw how, with the rise of Christianity in Islam, which were really, again, religions that were trying to offer a new blueprint, a new model for human behavior, one that was not really going to honor the warrior as it was in the past, but rather to honor the sage, the saint, the compassionate person, for example, the charitable person. Um, Although those faiths started out that way, trying to create a new person, a new human, if you will, more spiritual, more mystical, due to the fact that those faiths grew and spread in areas that were largely filled with nomadic groups, which were very warlike, eventually those faiths became the basis for empire. Okay, we're talking about, for example, the Germanic tribes of Europe, the Arabian tribes of the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East, for example. They converted to those faiths, but they blended, of course, their own lifestyle, their own ideas about life, that life was a struggle, that life is war, for example, and they reframed those faiths that were centered on the inner soul, on the inner person, on awakening the most noble aspects of humanity and so on, and kind of transformed them into an outer struggle, an outer struggle, a struggle against evil, for example, so on. We see the rise in Europe of Christian warrior kingdoms, for example. Okay? And that is really a nomadic influence on those world religions. In the Middle East, we see the rise of the caliphates. And the caliphates, initially the original intention was just to be a community of believers, a religious community, but over time those caliphates turned out to be more about empire, expansionism, and so on, in conquest. So the nomads also had a great influence on the development of world religions as well, as we can see. And last but not least, another influence of the nomads in world civilizations had to do with the fall of empires. We saw, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire as a direct result of nomadic incursions, nomadic invasions against the Roman state, against the Roman Empire. For example, the Huns, that came from Central Asia, invaded Central Europe. The Germanic tribes of Central Europe were, to a certain degree, trying to escape the Huns, and they pressured the Romans, invaded more and more the Romans, and the Romans got encircled in the 5th century almost on all fronts, to the point that it was just untenable, and the whole empire disintegrated, at least the western wing of the Roman Empire. Again, it was due to the nomadic invasions as well. Okay? So, the nomads have played a key role in shaping world civilizations and world history. All right, so now we're moving in the timeline, and we're going to see another wave of nomadic invasions. And here, the explanation for those nomadic invasions, why is it that we're going to see a series of nomadic invasions worldwide happening, let us just say, from the year 900 all the way to 1500, let us just say, AD. And the explanation here has to do with the environment, climate change in this case. Okay, it is reported by scholars, scientists, historians, again, that have studied this period of time, and now with a more understanding, of course, of environmental science, is that the Earth goes through cycles, time cycles. Some of those cycles are warm cycles, others are cooling cycles, and they alternate. Okay. Around the year 850, it is estimated that around that time, we see the beginning of a new cycle. And that cycle was a cooling cycle, which means that previously the Earth was going through a warm cycle. Okay. So from 850 all the way to the 1300s or thereabouts, we see this cooling of the planet. And it affected certain areas more than others. This doesn't mean the entire world was affected in exactly the same way. But overall, the temperature of the world decreased a few degrees. Again, this is not by any means an ice age. This is, not even close. It's just that it is cooler than the warmer cycles. What that means is that during a cooling cycle, certain areas of the world, particularly the northern globe, okay, so the northern regions, in other words, of the world become even cooler. They receive less rain because there's less water being evaporated into the atmosphere because the temperature is dropping, okay? And because there's less water being evaporated, there's less precipitation. With less precipitation, what that means is that there is less food supply, period. Less vegetation, for example, for animals to feed on. Just wild animals in general. And remember that the nomads live off of wild animals. They hunt them or they herd those animals. They move them around from place to place. So since there's less pasturage available, is on the decrease because of the scarcity of rainfall, therefore there's less people to feed as well. Okay, the wild animals, that population decreases, so therefore the nomads must pursue an alternative source of subsistence other than just relying on hunting or foraging or herding, animals and so on. And the alternative strategy is to raid sedentary populations that produce food. Those agriculturalists that live along those rivers, they do have the water to grow crops. So because those civilizations have water to grow crops, well, they're raided in order for the nomads to actually steal some food, some crops, animals, etc. However, because this is a cooling cycle that goes on and on and on, year after year, decade after decade, and is going to span for a few centuries, it is not going to be enough to just raid and leave that civilization, but rather the nomads are going to feel the need to actually invade and permanently occupy, in other words, that civilization. The ones that are going to become very, very active will be the Mongols, the Vikings, and the Aztecs. The Arabs and the Turks were others that were also on the move. They were part of this process as well. We're not going to get to examine the Arabs and Turks in this discussion. But just for your information, the Mongols, the Vikings, and the Aztecs were not by any means the only ones, again, that were on the move. We're going to see now a permanent occupation, once again, of those civilizations, the Vikings invading and occupying Europe, the Mongols invading and occupying China, for example, and the Aztecs, central Mexico. And in doing so, they're going to be transforming those civilizations, the civilizations that they invaded and occupied, and we're going to see a remaking of those civilizations. We're going to see the emergence of a new world. It's going to be called the early modern world. The early modern world. You know, some of the long-lasting effects, again, that the nomadic invasions are going to have is that they're going to produce a series of global encounters. Civilizations that have remained kind of isolated from one another to a certain degree are going to increase their interactions with one another as a result of those invasions. Okay, so we're going to see a number of global encounters, the end of cultural isolation. We're going to see a more cultural interchange taking place as civilizations are being invaded by other groups. Again, they're going to be now becoming more and more in contact again with alien and foreign cultural elements. And there's going to be a blend and a kind of a hybrid taking place. We're also going to see the rise of international trade because, as we'll see, one of the things that the nomads did was to promote commercial exchange. They're going to bring with them that idea that they're not just there to take over and rule that civilization and collect taxes, but rather to expand the empire, particularly the economic and financial, if you will, aspects of the empire. You know, increased trade. It was a way to rapidly increase treasure. Again, it's not just enough to collect tribute, but rather to promote trade. So we're going to see the rise of international trade during this process as well. And last but not least, we're going to see also the rise of warrior empires. You know, just like we mentioned, you know, in the introduction, we see also the merging of the skills, the warrior skills of the nomads, being married with the bureaucratic, administrative skills of the sedentary peoples that they're occupying, that they're invading. And out of that merge, the war technologies, the war skills of the nomads married with the administrative skills of bureaucratic skills of the sedentary peoples, we're going to see a new kind of empire. And that empire is going to be more like a war machine, in other words, well administered, well managed, and of course is going to be also geared towards expansion as well. Okay, all of those four elements are going to be critical for the rise of this new world called the early modern world. Okay. All right, so let's look first and foremost at the Vikings. So the Vikings were not really known during this time as Vikings. You know, in Europe, they were known as Norsemen, the peoples from the north. The term Viking was ascribed to them much, much later. And we're going to explain why again in just a few moments. But they're going to be one of the very first groups that are going to respond, as we'll see, to this climatic change that I just explained. Okay, and they're going to be the first ones that are going to significantly impact the civilizations that were closest to them, the Europeans. They're the first ones that started this process, if you will. The Mongols came next, and then the Aztecs after that. Okay. All right, so let's look at the background, first and foremost, of the Vikings, or the Norsemen. They come from a region of Northern Europe known as Scandinavia. The Scandinavian countries today are Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, including, of course, Finland as well. But those were the original home of the Vikings. Okay, as you can see here, when we look at the geography of Scandinavia, it's really, again, in the northern fringes of Europe, which means that this is going to be the coldest region of Europe. Okay, this is one of the reasons why the Vikings were known as the children of the frozen north. Okay, the children of the frozen north. So this is the kind of environment that the Vikings adapted after thousands of years of inhabiting this region. They adapted to live in long winters that in many cases did not see the light of sun for weeks. Okay, there are certain time frames of the long winters in which the nights are endless. Okay, there's really no sunlight, in other words. But conversely, during the summer times, which are short as well, there are time frames of their summers that are also endless. And what that means is that they don't have any nights as well. Those are the kind of patterns of light and dark, again, that they have adapted to. As you can see, there are plenty of mountains. In Scandinavia is a mountainous region. What that indicates is that there's limited land for agriculture because of the mountains, but because also of the overall climate. Okay, the long winters and the short summers means that they only have a very short window of opportunity every year to grow crops. Okay, and keep that in mind. Again, this is not really a region where you can actually have a surplus, grain every year to sustain large populations, to have, an agricultural civilization, for example. Because of those geographical constrictions or limitations, the Vikings are going to be very prone to the sea, seafaring oriented, because they had limited opportunities in their own land to sustain large populations. Whenever they experience, of course, an increase of populations, the idea for them was to expand outwards. And so they're going to look at the sea, they're going to develop navigation systems, ships, and they're going to become one of the the first navigators in Europe, to use their technologies to expand and create great discoveries. One of the major discoveries of the Vikings was really the discovery of the New World. They actually arrived to North America centuries before Columbus. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. Okay, something that we're going to get to stress just down the road. All right, so let's look at Viking society and culture rather quickly. Where the Vikings come from, what were their cultures like, their society like, just in general terms. Now, the Vikings were really an offshoot of the Germanic tribes of Central Europe. Okay. According to some scholars, some of the northern Germanic tribes moved into Scandinavia in the distant past. Now, how long ago was that? Okay, so it's uncertain. There's so many dates, that get thrown around, but for sure, whether this was 10,000 BC or whether this was 4,500 BC or 2000 BC. Okay, so there's so many different conflicting, of course, dates there. But undeniably, the Scandinavians, the Vikings in this case, and the Germans are really, they share the same ancestors. Okay, and they belong once upon a time to a single group. Okay, so some of those tribes from that group move up north, and they, in isolation, created their own distinct, unique expression. So they are indeed Indo-European, in other words, of the Germanic tribal branch. As such, they also brought with them the political structure of the Indo-Europeans. They do have kings. They're not absolute rulers. Remember, they're elected. And they're elected by an assembly of warriors. This is very important. They are indeed a warrior society. Okay? War for them is central, and they also glorify war as well. Okay, it is the whole basis of their culture. Women in those societies enjoy significant freedom. They can own land. They can divorce their husbands, and they can remarry, for example. They can move around freely, and so on. Women do enjoy significant liberty and liberties in those societies. They tended to live in Scandinavia in small nested communities, not necessarily large settlements or large kingdoms necessarily, but small nested communities. And their mode of subsistence initially was hunting and gathering. Eventually they developed other strategies like fishing and foraging. And just before they began to raid Europe, they also started, of course, with farming. But once again, farming was extremely limited to the Vikings for reasons that I just explained, in the assessment of geography. Okay, just the climate, the mountains, for example, the limited land available, and so on. Okay, so they do have limitations, in terms of farming. Their language, at some point, they all shared a single language, the Old Norse, as it was called. And they were also, at some point, known for having developed a writing system that they inscribe messages or certain ideas or symbols and so on in certain stone pillars. They're called runestones. Okay, runestones. So they did indeed develop a system of writing, and they left many of those runestones again in different locations in which they inscribed, in many cases, the identity of a community, for example, some religious inscriptions that dealt with the deeds of some of the rulers, and so on. All right, so in terms of the religion, Norse religion, Viking religion, um, can be understood as a religion that believed in a series of gods that were responsible for the universe and creation at large. So it's polytheistic. So it's not merely animistic in that they're just worshiping spirits, but rather they do believe in major gods that created the world and managed the world as well. One of the supreme beings that the Vikings believed in, the supreme god of the Vikings was Odin. Okay, he is considered to be like the creator of everything, the creator of the universe, but he's a god that was mostly associated with war, for example. Okay, because this is a warrior society. And so war has also its origins in the gods as well. And Odin is really the one that is the supreme, if you will, warrior of the universe, Odin. Okay, so this is the god that oversees the entire world, and this is the god that the kings, for example, landlords and warlords as well, venerated the most. Okay, so it is really the god of the elites, if you will. Okay, below Odin was Thor. Thor was the god of thunder and lightning. He's also associated with warfare as well, because he's really waging war against his enemies. He's carrying with him this hammer in the sky, for example, with his hammer smashing his enemies and so on. And Thor becomes more like the god of the masses as a whole. It's not just for the elites, not just for the kings and the landlords and so on, but this is for the general masses in general. Okay, it's more personal, it's more approachable, and this is the most popular deity among the Vikings. Freya is a feminine deity associated with harmony, with beauty, with seduction as well. This is the equivalent of the goddess Venus, for example, among the Greco-Roman mythology, for example, which was the goddess of love. Okay, so Freya was along those lines as well among the Vikings. Later on, of course, in Christian times, those deities, for example, Freya, will be associated with the Virgin. Okay, it's a feminine, of course, deity, Virgin of love, compassion, healing, and so on. Now, the Vikings do believe in the afterlife, and the afterlife is conceived as a place where, if you want to go to the highest paradise, this is really the ultimate reward for any Viking. It is the place where the fallen warriors go to. Those that die in battle, the slain, in other words, they go to Valhalla. Valhalla is the Viking heaven, and this is where people that actually die in battle go to. So there is, of course, an incentive for the Vikings never to die in bed. You want to die in battle, okay? Because this is the greatest honor. This is your ticket to heaven, in other words, okay? So that reveals, of course, among the Vikings, a value of warfare as the highest goal, the highest aspiration, the greatest honor. Okay, and this is quite a normal state of affairs for the Viking. In other words, in Viking religion, we also see shamanism, magic, and sorcery, meaning that among the Vikings there were individuals that claimed to have the ability to communicate with the spirit world. That's what shamanism is. To communicate with the spirit of the dead, to communicate with the spirits of nature, for example. Okay, that is shamanism. Now, ingesting, for example, hallucinogenic, plants and so on, in order to produce or induce, if you will, visions of spirits and so on. Shamanism. Magic and sorcery, the idea of using certain incantations and formulas, rituals, aided by the use of plants as well, magical plants, in order to manipulate the world of nature, or to manipulate people, if you will, by casting spells, for example, or a hex, and so on and so forth. That was part also of the magical world of the Vikings as well. Okay, so this is something that, of course, from the Christian perspective, this is considered paganism, in other words, the pagan religions. All right, another very important aspect of the Viking culture and society is that they also, at some point, because they experience significant limitations in their environment. Remember, they were prone to the sea, they were prone to step out of Scandinavia and engage in other strategies, if you will, of survival, because they were warlike. As they build vessels in order to start exploring bodies of water and moving into other places, they use their skills of warfare in order to, on one hand, raid other communities in order to steal treasure, for example, from them, or trade. And so this is very important, that the Vikings did not really distinguish raiding from trading. They were indistinguishable. As a matter of fact, they were part of the same process. When they were raiding a place is when that place was indefensible. When there were no defenses, for example, they saw that there was a community, they had a local church, they had nobody to defend it, they will raid it. They will steal treasure from it. When they get to a place where there was walled and very fortified, and they had, of course, some armies protecting it and so on, they will approach as merchants and they will trade with them. Okay? So for them, it was just a survival strategy, again, that enabled them to increase their likelihood to have the means, in other words, to sustain their communities, again, raiding and trading. And so this is going to develop, of course, a certain tendency towards commerce. Of course, they do come from this merchant background. As they're beginning to establish trading relationships with other societies, they are indeed creating a merchant class amongst themselves. In Scandinavia, they built navigable bays. They were known as fjords or jords, okay, where they were dock their ships, they would station them, and they will, during winter time, go out and raid or trade. So again, they timed their activities during winter time. So it is during winter time that they became even more active again in that regard. Okay, so they were over time got very, very sophisticated as shipbuilders and skilled navigators. Okay, they became very, very proficient at building ships and also at navigation as well, understanding the sea currents, for example, wind currents. They were able to read, of course, the stars. They had certain instruments to mark the position of the sun, to orient themselves, and they use in their ships both sails and also rowing as well, as you can see in this depiction. And usually at the very, very end of their ships, they will place the head of a sea monster, actually a dragon. And the idea was to scare the sea spirits away and to scare the land spirits away from the places that they invaded. That was their idea. But whenever they return back to Scandinavia, they will hide, they will take off those sea monsters' heads from their ships in order not to scare their own land spirits away. Okay? You can see here, the kind of dragon that they actually place on at the very, very head of their ships. Again, to be used for those purposes that I just explained. All right, so what are the reasons for the Viking raids? We're going to see now the Vikings coming into Europe and launching a series of raids. What are the reasons for that? All right, so one is, as I mentioned, their ship technology got much better and better over the centuries. So just before they started the raids around the 700s and 800s AD, they had already very well developed the kind of vessels that will allow them to not only raid certain areas of Europe, but also to conduct a series of massive explorations and colonization ventures as well across the European continent. Okay, so one, again, was ship technology development. Number two, and this is, again, a quite accident, if you will, of history, is that the Vikings were invited in Europe before they raided Europe. They were invited to fight as mercenaries. They were invited to fight to fight in Europe as mercenaries by the heirs of the Carolingian Empire. This is the empire that Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, built between the first decades of the 1800s. So Charlemagne really was trying to unify Europe. Remember, he's really creating what is called the Holy Roman Empire. We talked about that in the previous topic. Bringing all of those different kingdoms, under his leadership. But when Charlemagne died, his descendants, his sons and grandsons, began to fight over the empire, and they divided the empire. So this empire did not really last very long. The Carolingian Empire, as it was called, it got divided. Charles the Bald got the western part, what today is France. Lothar got the middle portion, it was Alsace-Lorraine. And Louis the German got what today is the country of Germany, in other words. So this empire got partitioned, of course, and they started waging war against each other, trying to reunify it, of course, under their own leadership. And as many people began to die in those wars, they depleted their own army. So in order to bring soldiers to fight in those wars, they invited the Vikings as mercenaries. Of course, so the Vikings actually came into Europe. They began to fight either for one or the other of those parties. And while they're there, the Vikings were able to see, to a certain degree, the wealth of the Christian churches. You know, that the Christian churches were filled with a lot of jewelry, with gold, for example, with a lot of treasure, in other words. So this is, you know, going to become a temptation for the Vikings. When the Vikings went back to Scandinavia, they disseminated the news that, look, you know, we went to Europe and, you know, they were actually very, very rich, in other words. Okay, so this is was the unfortunate outcome, you know, of the Viking, you know, raids, is that they got indeed invited by the Europeans, you know, beforehand. They were brought in. And number three, of course, is climate change. As the climate began to change around the year 850, the Vikings felt even more pressure, you know, by the environment. They already lived in a kind of very difficult environment, as I mentioned, but now they feeling, of course, descent of temperature, and this is going to place even more the need for the Vikings to move out and now to raid, and not only to raid and steal treasure, but rather to just move there and try to settle permanently again in the different regions of Europe, okay, because of this climate change. So we're going to see a series of raids. The Vikings are now launching raids on Europe and the North Atlantic. And there were two groups, particularly the Swedes, again, on one hand, and the Danish on the other, of course. Now, during this time, there was no such a thing as Swedish or Danish or Norway, you know, Norwegian, for example, you know. It was all considered one single region. This is just to indicate that those that lived in what today is the country of Sweden, called the Swedes, are going to be the ones that are moving into places of Eastern Europe, for example. Okay, so the Swedes are going to be moving into Eastern Europe, and they're going to be actually moving into what is called Russia. Now, Russia didn't exist. It was a region that was populated by a group of people known as the Slavs. Okay, the Slavs, Slavic or Slavs. But as the Vikings moved into this region, they took over and they created a series of kingdoms, like the kingdom of Kiev, for example, who were created by the Vikings, by the Swedes, and the kingdom of Novgorod. Okay, the kingdom of Novgorod. Their main idea of moving into Eastern Europe was to build connections with the Byzantine Empire, with the city of Constantinople. That was their main idea. Again, they're moving closer and closer to Byzantium and Constantinople. They're reaching out to that empire, and they're building trade relationships with them. Okay, that was their idea. So as you can see, the beginning of Russia, as you can see, you know, goes back to those Viking invasions. Okay, Russia just didn't exist, as I just mentioned. Okay, as you can see in this map, again, this is a region where the Vikings are moving, and they're beginning to establish the very first kingdoms there in that region. The Danes are going to be moving more into parts of Western Europe. Okay, and they're going to be invading, raiding, but also settling in some areas of Western Europe and creating more permanent, of course, kingdoms there and societies. For example, Normandy. Okay, the Danes are moving there in about the year 841 AD. And they create what is called the Kingdom of Normandy in northern France. Okay, the Kingdom of Normandy. They're also invading England, Ireland, and Scotland, okay, the Danes. And this is a process that took place from the year 793 all the way to 1066 AD. Again, so it spanned for a few centuries, the raids, the invasion, settlement, and as we'll see, England, of course, is going to fall to the Vikings in the year 1066 AD altogether. Okay, as you can see here, this is again the invasions, the raids, the routes that the Vikings took in order to raid those societies again. So they're going to be creating, as we'll see in just a few moments, of course, new states, new kingdoms, for that matter. Okay. As I mentioned, in the year 1066, finally, with the help of the Normans, in Normandy, northern France, the Vikings will launch a full-scale invasion into England, and England, all of them, will actually fall to the Vikings in the year 1066. This is known as the Norman conquest of England. It was led by William the Conqueror. As you can see, Normandy, this is a region of northern France. Again, that got settled there in the year 841 AD. Participated again in this epic, historical event when England ceases to be exclusively Anglo-Saxon, is now going to be Anglo-Scandinavian from this point onward. So there's going to be now in the history of England a very strong Scandinavian influence, again, because now they're going to be ruled by the Vikings, okay, England. The Vikings go also into the Mediterranean Ocean. They explore it, and they set out to conquer portions of the Mediterranean world. They do conquer southern Italy and the island of Sicily as well. From the year 999 to the year 1139, we see those massive conquests. The Vikings are engaged in this process, and they eventually are able to conquer southern Italy and Sicily as well. Okay. Over time, the Vikings are determined to move also into the North Atlantic in order to expand their settlements as well. They settled in Iceland, for example, and also Greenland. They established a series of communities there. And eventually, they continue their exploration into the North Atlantic to the point that by the year 1000, the Vikings arrived to the New World. Okay, they do arrive to the New World, and what today is called Nova Scotia, in eastern Canada, for example. Present day, Canada. They do establish 3 communities or 3 settlements: Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Although they did not last very long, because they were so far from their main line of supply. Their supply line, is Scandinavia. So they're not going to have easy access to resources to really build permanent settlements there. So they had enormous difficulties actually continuing this project, not only because the line of supply was too far away, but also because of the Native Americans, of course. They had some issues with Native Americans, according to sources as well. Okay, so those Viking settlements did not last very long. Okay, but they do come to the New World way before Christopher Columbus. Okay, that is a documented fact. Okay, as you can see here in this map. All right, so let's look at the impact of the Vikings on Europe. They're going to create a significant impact on European culture and society on so many different levels. For example, number one, the Vikings pioneered European exploration and discovery. Okay, they are the ones that start this process of sea exploration. Sea exploration in the North Atlantic, for example, islands, settlements, places like Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and of course arriving to North America as well. They're the ones that actually started this process of colonization of North America, but as I mentioned, it failed. But nonetheless, they're the ones that kind of pioneered this process. Not to mention their also exploration of the Mediterranean Ocean as well. Okay, so they are indeed pioneering this new era of the age of exploration, the age of navigation, the age of discovery, the Vikings. They are the ones opening up that new chapter. They are the ones also creating new states. We mentioned Russia. Didn't exist. The formation of Kiev, for example, and Novgorod. Those kingdoms that are going to be the founding kingdoms of Russia, for example. The Kingdom of Hungary in 910 was also part of this process of the Vikings moving into that region and creating, new states. The Kingdom of Poland also came out of this process of the Viking invasions of Eastern Europe. So the whole Eastern European region, which was not really politically organized, suddenly emerges, it bursts, if you will, into existence as a result of the Viking invasions. The Kingdom of Ireland and the Kingdom of Scotland were the direct creations of the Vikings as well. Iceland, for example, which was settled by the Vikings created a democratic government in Iceland. Created a democratic government in which the land got divided in four. And every section had an assembly or tribal council, it was called the Thing, by the way, in which the people assembled and participated and voted, again, on almost every major decision that needed to be carried out. The people assembled again and actually democratically was governing their own communities again in Iceland. The Vikings also created a waves of revolutions in Europe. For example, we see an agricultural revolution taking place when the Vikings introduced in Europe what is called the heavy plow. Okay, it was a heavier equipment that will actually rip the soil open, that was thicker, for example. In places like Northern Europe, the soil was very thick, very muddy, and it was very hard to till the land, again, with the simple plow that was used in Southern Europe. But when the Vikings introduced the heavy plow, now all over Europe, people got a hold of an equipment that was able to work the land in a way that they were able to prepare hundreds and hundreds of acres of land for cultivation in a very rapid manner because of this very heavy plow. So this really increased productivity, as we'll see. maximize production manifold. It was a kind of an industrial type of equipment that they introduced. They introduced also what is called the three-plot system, uh, changing the kind of system that existed in Europe. It was really very simplistic in the past, in a system that they inherited from the Romans. It was called the two-plot system, in which people actually just grew crops on one part of the land and the other, they let it rest. It was fallow, in other words. Very simplistic. But here, the Vikings introduced was something called the three-plot system, dividing the land into three sections. On one section, they will grow what is called legumes, during spring. In the other, they will grow grain during fall, like wheat and barley, for example. And on the other third, they will graze cattle in order to fertilize that land. And then over time, after a series of years, they will shift, it will rotate, in other words. So it was highly productive. It was self-replenishing, if you will, the nutrients, the fertilizer, and it was highly productive as well. So this is going to lead, as we'll see, to a revolution in agriculture. Okay, so the Vikings are altering the economy of Europe by introducing those two techniques. This led eventually, of course, to other revolutions, like a technological revolution. During this time, there was an invention of the hand grain grinder during this time. So there's more grain being produced. We got new gadgets like this hand grain grinder, as you can see. That facilitated, of course, the grinding of grain, like barley and so on, and producing flour again. So we see, again, more and more commerce. The proliferation of water mills as well. The water mill already existed in Europe, but there's going to be a mass proliferation of the water mill. And the water mill was like a machine that people use for grinding, for example, for leather work, for metal work, and so on. It moves an axle, of course. It's a machine that actually provides, of course, propulsion, and you can use it again for pretty much for anything, for manufacturing, in other words. Okay, manufacturing. So we see the increasing of manufacturing in Europe. The invention of the windmill. In the absence of water, of course, there's also the wind power, and it does the same principle. The windmill is the same thing, again, for manufacturing purposes as well. So all of those, of course, inventions, those technological inventions, is really leading to a commercial revolution. There's food surplus, more food being produced, and there's population increase. With population increase, there's a demand of goods. There's more and more people demanding more and more goods. They're demanding food products, clothing, and tools, etc. So we see, of course, Europe in transformation during this time. Goods are being moved in wagons. We see, of course, the development of what's called the covered wagon. This is the kind of wagon that is also going to be used in the American West much, much later, of course, in the so-called Wild West, the covered wagon. And there was also the need to open up new trade routes as well. And the Vikings are instrumental in opening up those trade routes in order to move those goods around. So Europe is becoming far more interconnected during this time as a result of the simple techniques that the Vikings introduced that led to all the series of changes that I've been explaining up to this point. And so now, again, food and products, again, are going back and forth across Europe. And the Vikings are facilitating that with, again, the trade routes that are being opened up across Europe. Okay. This in turn led to an urban revolution. the creation of urban centers. We see the formation of towns across Europe. People used to live in the countryside, around the manor houses of the landlords, for example, serving them, growing crops for them as peasants or serfs. But now, as the population increases and people are demanding new products, the merchants realize that, look, there's more people to feed. More and more people require basic, products. So the merchants are staging fairs around castles and monasteries, trying to offer those products to the people. And the people are coming from the countryside, from the manor houses. They're flocking to those fairs in order to purchase them. So over time, those places, the monasteries and the castles and the fairs, over time, they become the little towns, the towns of Europe. People are beginning to settle there. And they create a town, okay? They create a town. And the towns have classes. They have merchants, tradesmen, for example, journeymen as well. They have their own town halls and town governments as well. So again, Europe is changing. It's becoming more urban. People are moving now to the urban centers and they're creating towns. And this is becoming, again, now more and more the norm in Europe as a result of the Viking invasions. Last but not least, the Crusades. This is another impact that the Vikings had on Europe. Europe is going to become even more and more militant in their faith because the Vikings, when they raided Europe, were not Christians. They were pagans, as I mentioned. They were known as the heathens from the north. We're invaded by the pagans and the heathens, They're moving into our churches, and they're sacking our churches, They're raiding for the gold, and they don't respect, the church, the sanctity of the temple, and so on. So this is going to create among the Christians the need to fight for Christianity, that they needed to defend their faith, in other words, fight for Christian civilization. And so we see a process of Christians trying to not only defend themselves from the nomads, in this case from the Vikings, the barbarians, but also to defend themselves from the heathens, to defend the faith. Okay? And so they initiate a series of crusades, the so-called Northern Crusades that span from 1125 to 1350. They were, again, Christian knights, the Teutonic knights that were moving up north to fight the heathens, in other words, to fight for the cross, to fight for Christ, and so on, to defend Christianity. So what that means is that during the Crusades, the Christians were not only fighting the Muslims in the East to defend Christianity, they were also fighting the Vikings in the north as well. Okay, that's another aspect of that. Okay. Now, at some point, of course, there was also the attempt to deal with the Vikings in some other way other than just outright conflict, and that is to send missionaries. Okay, particularly the English and the German Christians are going to send missionaries up to Scandinavia to try to convert the Vikings by persuasion, not necessarily by force, but persuasion. And we see, of course, that this was perhaps even more successful, a more effective strategy than warfare. Sending missionaries that will slowly but surely convert the Scandinavians to Christianity. Because by the 12th century, most of Scandinavia converted to Christianity. So this is the final conversion of the Vikings. Okay? So what we have seen so far is one group of nomads, in this case the Vikings, being affected by climate change. It started around 850. They're becoming more and more active. They're feeling the pressure of scarcity of resources and food. And they're raiding, of course, the sedentary populations to the south, the Europeans, trying to steal treasure, but not only that, but they're trying to permanently occupy them, and in doing so, they're going to alter and remake in very significant ways those civilizations. We already saw in this very last part how they impacted Europe, creating new states, for example, creating a series of revolutions, agricultural revolution, technological, commercial, uh, urban revolution as well, and of course the Crusades. Okay, when we come back in part two, we're going to look at the Mongols. This is going to be a group of Northern Asia that is going to also be affected by climate change, and they're going to move into China, as we'll see. And they're also going to be creating a series of changes along the way as they're going to expand far and wide and create the largest land-based empire in world history. Everything will be, of course, assessed in session 2 when we come back. This is all I have for you. Thank you.